When Elena Morales arrived at her husband's funeral, she wasn't allowed inside. Her only daughter, Amelia, now a polished socialite, had erased her from the guest list, and from her father's will. Everything from the mansion to the family business now belonged to Amelia. But the betrayal didn't end there. A late-night call from a nurse revealed that Stephen Morales had been forced to sign papers while barely conscious. What Amelia thought was a flawless victory began to unravel when Elena opened a long-forgotten safety deposit box and uncovered a hidden trust, one that made her, not her daughter, the legal guardian of all their assets. What followed was a quiet but devastating courtroom war. The daughter who craved power met the mother she had underestimated. Armed with Stephen's notarized trust and the testimony of those who remembered the truth, Elena fought not for wealth, but for dignity, for memory, and for the right to say that her husband had not forgotten her. When the judge declared the will invalid, Amelia's empire of lies collapsed. But Elena didn't celebrate. Instead, she made one final choice: to donate the mansion that had torn her family apart, turning it into a community arts foundation bearing her husband's name. In the garden, she planted one last rosebush, grown from a cutting of the one she and Stephen had planted the year Amelia was born. As the wind brushed her hands, she realized that not all inheritances are measured in money. Some are measured in what you choose to let go. The morning air carried that southern stillness, thick with jasmine and silent judgment. I stood on the other side of the wrought iron gates of S, where Stephen's Comey daughter, Amelia S. Before I could take a step, two men in dark gray suits appeared on either side of the gate. Mrs. Morales, oh, BL. This is my husband's funeral, I said softly, trying to stay calm. I drafted his first will. I took care of him through 3 surgeries. We were married in this very chapel. The younger man stiffened. I'm sorry, ma'am. It's a private event. Miss Amelia Morales has full control of the guest list. My phone vibrated in my purse. I didn't need to look to know who it was from, but I did anyway. A message. One line. Please don't make this harder than it needs to be. I stared at the screen. The words struck harder than the guards' voices. She didn't want a scene. She didn't want me there. Not now, not with Merida's elite watching. I stepped back slowly, my heels scraping against the stone curb. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I simply stood there while my own daughter buried her father, and me at the same time. That night, I sat alone in the kitchen, hands wrapped around a cup of chamomile tea that had gone cold, staring into nothing. The house was too quiet for a day that should have ended with shared tears and eulogies. Instead, it ended with security guards and a message that felt like a restraining order. The ache in my chest wasn't exactly grief. It was something else, the recognition that this hadn't happened suddenly. It had been building for years. Amelia had never been cruel as a child, but even then, her smile carried something, charming on the surface, too calculated underneath. I used to think it was intelligence. Maybe it was. Or maybe it was something else. I remember the summer she was 12. She took my checkbook and forged my signature to buy herself a pair of white riding boots. When I found the receipt under her mattress, she didn't cry or beg for forgiveness. She smiled, not from joy, but with the confidence of someone who knows you love her too much to abandon her. I forgave her. Course I always did. Piano recitals, scraped knees, broken promises disguised as teenage tantrums. I forgave them all. I told myself I had to. I was the one who raised her almost alone while Stephen traveled from city to city, raising capital instead of his daughter. I was the one who stayed, packing lunches, comforting heartbreaks, ignoring every warning sign. And now I sat here, drinking cold tea in an empty house while my daughter buried my husband without me. My email chimed. I opened my laptop with a heaviness I couldn't name. Subject: Estate Resolution. Stephen Morales. An attached PDF. The signature was recent, the language clear. Everything, every peso, every property, including the mansion on Cologne Avenue, was left to Amelia Morales, with no mention of me. I read it twice, then again. The tea was cold, but my pulse was burning. The daughter I had raised had not only excluded me from the funeral, she had erased me from his legacy. And yet, somewhere deep inside, I knew this wasn't the end. I drove to the mansion just after sunrise, the sky still tied to the remnants of night. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary. I hadn't slept. Too many questions hung in the air. Questions that didn't need answers, only acknowledgement. When I turned onto Cologne Avenue and saw the house, my breath caught. Not because it looked different, but because it didn't. The gray stone facade, the tall windows, the ivy clinging stubbornly to the eastern wall. Everything looked the same. Until I saw the garden. The roses were gone. The vast bed of English roses Stephen and I had planted the summer of our 25th anniversary had been ripped out. In their place lay gleaming white gravel and two perfectly symmetrical imported palm trees. Cold, lifeless. It looked like the entrance to a luxury hotel, not a home. I parked at the curb and stepped out slowly, deliberately. My heels crunched against the gravel as I approached the front door. Through the tall windows I could see the foyer. Where once hung portraits of our wedding and Amelia's christening, there were now colorless abstract paintings, lines and triangles without memory. The door opened before I could knock. A young housemaid I didn't recognize stood there, wide-eyed. "I came to see the house," I said calmly, though my chest ached. She hesitated. "Miss Morales gave very clear instructions, ma'am. You're not allowed to enter." "I'm very sorry." Her voice dropped to a whisper. She said, "You're no longer family." I nodded once. Not in agreement but in closure. I turned and walked back to my car, my steps careful over the gravel that had replaced the garden Stephen used to tend in his slippers. Humming off-key, I sat in the driver's seat and stared at the mansion for a long time. The morning sun struck the windows, but it didn't feel warm. It felt like standing before a museum that used to be your home, filled with things you recognized, curated by someone who never understood them. 3 days later, a cream-colored envelope arrived from a law firm I didn't recognize. I already knew what it contained before opening it. Amelia had filed documents to claim the house in Roma District, the same house Stephen and I bought when we first married, before his company took off, before the mansion, before everything. We had kept it even after moving because it had roots. It had history. My name was still on the original deed. But now, according to the revised documents, it was considered part of the marital estate under the new will. I had 30 days to vacate. I didn't cry. I folded the letter and placed it in the kitchen drawer beside old photographs and receipts. Then I sat at the table, tracing the wood grain with my finger. That night, the phone rang shortly after 10. I almost didn't answer, thinking it was a wrong number, or another solicitor, but the voice on the other end was soft, hesitant. I didn't cry. I folded the letter and placed it in the drawer beside the stove, where I kept old photographs and utility receipts. I sat at the kitchen table for a while, tracing the grain of the wood with one finger. That night, the phone rang just after 10. I almost didn't answer, thinking it was another telemarketer or a wrong number, but the voice on the other end was soft, nervous. "Mrs. Morales." Yes, I was one of Mr. Morales's nurses. In his final weeks. There was a long pause. She made him sign things when he was barely awake, when he could hardly breathe. He didn't know what he was agreeing to. "I thought you should know." Before I could ask her name, the line went dead. The next morning I drove straight to the bank on Alvaro Obregon Street. I hadn't opened the safety deposit box in years. Not since Stephen and I finalized some old trust agreements. Most of our documents were digital by then, but I had always insisted on keeping physical copies, just in case. The clerk handed me the key and led me to the back. When I opened the small gray door, the air inside was dry and still. Between birth certificates and bonds was a thick manila folder labeled in Stephen's neat handwriting. Elena. Originals, handle with care. I stared at it for a long moment before reaching for it. Whatever battle Amelia thought she had already won, she had clearly forgotten one thing. Asterisk asterisk, I was the one who taught Stephen how to protect what mattered. Asterisk asterisk. I hadn't spoken to Clara Rendon in nearly 5 years, but she answered my call on the first ring. No preamble, she said. Just bring whatever you have. I'll be here. Her office hadn't changed. Heavy oak shelves, framed degrees from UNAM and Harvard, and that same quiet authority she carried like a second skin. She poured us both coffee without asking and closed the door behind me. I slid the folder across her desk. She flipped through the documents, her eyes narrowing, her brow furrowing in rhythm with each page. When she reached the notarized trust agreement, she stopped and leaned back in her chair. "This is gold," she said softly. "He signed it 8 years ago," I explained, "right after we discovered the first tumor in his liver. We thought we'd have more time, and he never revoked it." I shook my head. "No one else knew it existed. We archived it quietly. It was meant to protect our assets in case things went downhill fast. The document named me as trustee. Everything, including the mansion, would pass first to me, and only later to any future grandchildren, if Amelia ever had them." Clara looked at me with something close to admiration. "This overrides the will," she said. "She buried me while I was still breathing," I murmured. "I didn't fight at the funeral. I didn't scream when she changed the locks. But this..." I touched the paper lightly. "This is where I draw the line." Clara studied me for a moment, then nodded slowly. "We'll file a motion to contest the will and invoke the trust. It won't be easy, but this is solid. You were silent but not blind." "I learned from the best," I said quietly. But the words hit heavier than I expected, because the best, Stephen, was gone. And the person I had loved most in the world was now someone I had to face in court. While Clara began preparing the first round of documents, I folded my hands in my lap and gazed out the window at the city where I had built a life. Storm was coming. I had waited long enough. Clara filed the motion 2 days after our meeting. By the time I returned home, the court registry already listed a case number. ***, my name beside Amelia's *** in the cold neutrality of legal typeface. The wheels had begun to turn. That week, I made discreet calls to the people who had once filled the mansion's hallways with movement and care. Housekeepers, drivers, even the florist who used to deliver the same white lilies Stephen always ordered for our anniversary. Most were gone. The few who answered were polite, professional, distant. Only one agreed to meet. Thomas Aguilar, our gardener for nearly 12 years. He met me at a small café in La Condesa. His hands weathered, his voice low. "She started replacing us as soon as Mr. Morales was too sick to walk," he said, taking a sip of coffee he barely touched. "Said she wanted staff who didn't cling to the past. All of you who remembered." "Yes." He nodded. By the time he passed, there was no one left who knew what that place used to be. When I returned home, I sat down at Stephen's old laptop, the one Amelia hadn't thought to lock. I wasn't expecting much, maybe some calendar reminders or old notes. But one message stood out. It was sent to an old business contact from his investment days. No subject line. Just one sentence. "If anything happens, Elena knows where the truth is." The timestamp was 5 weeks before his death. I read it again and again, trying to find meaning between lines already heavy with it. He hadn't spoken to me about the message. He hadn't warned me about Amelia's intentions. But in the haze of his final weeks, he had left a sign. Not for lawyers, not for the public, for me. I leaned back, eyes closed. The silence of the house wrapped around me like a held breath finally released. Whatever pieces were still hidden, Stephen had trusted that I would find them. And that meant it was time to stop remembering and start proving. Clara moved quickly. The trust document I retrieved from the bank was in perfect condition. Attested, notarized, and verified with a digital timestamp. Stephen's signature was clear, dated, and stored in a certification platform I had insisted on using when cloud systems were still a novelty in inheritance law. The trust document I had taken from the bank was in perfect condition, witnessed, notarized, and backed by a digital verification record. Stephen's signature was clear, dated, and stored on a time certification platform I had insisted on using years ago, when cloud systems were still a novelty in inheritance law. He had humored me back then. Now, that insistence had become my strongest shield. We submitted it to the court along with the initial motion. The document stated unambiguously that I was the trustee of all primary assets, financial accounts, real estate, and intellectual property. Until Amelia turned 50 ***. She was 42. That gave me 8 years of control. 8 years she hadn't anticipated. Amelia received the court notice at her boutique yoga studio in Polanco, mid-class, wearing lilac leggings and a headset microphone. The courier told me later that she didn't flinch. She accepted the envelope, read the first page, and calmly continued teaching. The next morning, a reporter from the Yucatan Daily published a short piece quoting her directly. "My mother and I have been estranged. She abandoned my father long before he passed. I was the one who stayed. I managed everything when he was at his weakest." The article included a photo of Amelia outside her studio, arms crossed, expression soft yet firm, the kind of face that wins sympathy from those who only read headlines. I didn't respond. Not to the press, not to the whispers, not to the neighbors who began offering me tight, pitying condolences at the market, as if I'd done something unforgivable. Instead, I forwarded the article to Clara, who replied with a single blinking line. "That's all we needed." Because if Amelia truly believed the trust was worthless, she wouldn't have gone public. She wouldn't have tried to rewrite the story before the court heard the truth. I printed the article and placed it in the same folder that now held Stephen's trust, his final email, and a paper trail that proved this battle was no longer about emotion. It was about evidence. And I was nearly ready to bring everything to light. The courtroom was small. No cameras, no large jury. Just soft lighting and the echo of footsteps on polished floors. I sat at the plaintiff's table beside Clara, my hands folded, the trust file between us like a sealed chapter waiting to be read aloud. Amelia arrived 5 minutes late. Wearing black, always black. Her lawyer, young, talkative, and far too confident, began with a speech about filial duty and emotional strain. He called the revised will ***, a clear expression of Mr. Morales's final clarity. But clarity doesn't empty bank accounts. When Clara took the floor, she was calm, surgical. She began with the notarized trust, complete with timestamp, archived both physically and digitally. She presented the records showing the last date Stephen was mentally competent, supported by medical documents and a sworn statement from his attending physician. Then came the nurse's testimony. Her own trembling voice reading aloud the memory of Stephen, barely conscious, signing papers Amelia had insisted were urgent. The judge didn't interrupt once. Next came the notaries, one from the original trust, another from the contested will. Only one remembered Stephen speaking clearly, and it wasn't during the final signing. Amelia never looked at me. Not even when the financial records were shown, proving a silent transfer of nearly 12 million pesos from Stephen's account to hers, just 3 weeks before his death. Not even when the judge paused, 30 long seconds, before delivering the verdict. The trust, having been created and preserved under verifiable legal circumstances, will be upheld in full. The will presented by the defendant is hereby declared invalid. The words fell without celebration. Clara placed her hand gently over mine, but I didn't move. Amelia rose, lips pressed tight, shoulders straight, and walked out like an actress leaving a stage that had just collapsed behind her. Amelia rose without a word, her lips pressed tight, shoulders straight, as if walking off a stage that had just collapsed behind her. I remained seated, even after the judge left, even after the courtroom emptied. Because what I had fought for wasn't just a house or a set of bank accounts. It was the right to say that he hadn't forgotten me. Not at the end. Not when it truly mattered. 3 weeks passed after the verdict. The newspapers called it a quiet victory in court. The neighbors started greeting me again. Clara filed the final paperwork. The mansion's keys arrived by courier, along with a handwritten inventory of what remained inside. Furniture, accounting books, a few oil paintings that had survived Amelia's renovations. I hadn't yet decided what to do with it all. Then one morning my phone buzzed just after sunrise. A voicemail, no caller ID. Her voice was lower than I remembered. You took everything. I hope you're happy. There was a long pause, the kind that feels like someone's holding on to words they can't say. Then nothing. The message ended in silence. No apology, no anger. Just that faint thread of something close to regret, though never spoken aloud. I didn't call her back. Instead, I took the trust documents, placed them inside a plain manila envelope, and added a note. For your records, before sealing it, I highlighted one line in orange. Not a legal clause, not one with any weight in court. It was a sentence Stephen had insisted on writing himself. Hidden near the end beneath the signatures. May this house someday teach you what family truly means. I sent it to her studio without a return address. She would know who it came from. The next day, I drove to the mansion for the first time since the ruling. I parked in the circular driveway and walked slowly through the main doors, the ones I had chosen long before Amelia learned to use silence as a weapon. Inside, the air was still, untouched. Her perfume was gone. Her furniture removed. What remained was space, light, and memory. I stood in the foyer and let the silence speak. Then I passed the staircase, through the back doors, to what had once been my garden. I didn't move back in, not because I couldn't, or because the room still carried shadows of her presence. I didn't move back because it was never meant to be mine alone. The house had always been a symbol, of what Stephen built, of what we tried to preserve. But symbols decay when you hold on too tightly. So I donated it to the Yucatan Foundation for Arts and Education. They'd been searching for a permanent home for after-school programs and community workshops. Now they had 22 rooms and a restored garden. They asked if I wanted a plaque with my name. I declined. I suggested they use Stephen's instead. Asterisk, the Morales House. A legacy of learning and community. Asterisk. On my last visit before handing over the keys, I brought a rosebush. Not from a nursery, but from a cutting I'd kept in a ceramic pot behind the old Roma house. It came from our original garden, the one we planted the year Amelia was born. I dug the hole myself, in the corner where the shadow fell just right. I knelt in the soft soil and pressed the roots gently into the ground. My knees ached. My hands weren't as steady as they once were. But the rhythm of planting was familiar. Quiet, grounding. No one watched. No one needed to. When I stood, brushing the dirt from my palms, a light breeze stirred the leaves. It was the same corner where Stephen once told me that some things aren't built to last forever. They're built to mean something while they do. They say the dead leave us their possessions, but sometimes they leave us choices too. And I chose not to let betrayal become my legacy. The papers were signed that same afternoon. The foundation would begin its work the following month. I drove away with nothing in the back seat but an empty flower pot, and a lightness I hadn't felt in years. Because sometimes the most lasting inheritance isn't what you keep, it's what you choose to give away.